Hello, welcome everyone to this online symposium, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, Walding Through the Caribbean. My name is Soo-Kyung Lee. I'm Senior Curator of International Art at Tate Modern, and also one of the conveners of this symposium. It is organized by Hyundai Tate Research Centre Transnational in collaboration with University of the Arts London's Transnational Art Identity Nation Research Centre, also known as TRAIN, and the Transnational and Transcultural Art Culture Exchange Network, also known as TRACE. For these three research entities, focusing on transnational histories of art and the transcultural interconnections in contemporary art and public cultures, it felt very natural to work together on a symposium that reconsiders global histories of art with a particular attention to certain forms of global modernities. We have taken the Caribbean and Caribbean thought as a starting point, acknowledging the region's experience of the transhistorical forces of enslavement, colonialism, resource extraction, and climate emergency. We have chosen the foundational work of Caribbean thinkers Édouard Glissant, Stuart and Sylvia Wynter as the framework, for its ongoing and generative influence could transform our ways of relating to the world around us. The symposium is also connected with the exhibition at Tate Britain, Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art 1950s to Now, which opened to the public today. The exhibition highlights the work of artists from the Caribbean who made their home in Britain, forging new communities and identities that have transformed what British culture and society looks like now. The exhibition also includes several British artists whose work has been influenced and inspired by Caribbean themes and heritage, manifesting impacts of transnational exchanges and hybridity that are embedded in the current British culture. A symposium of this scale and ambition always has some brilliant people behind it, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them. I would like to thank Professor Ming Tianpo of Trace Network and Carleton University Center for Transnational Cultural Analysis, Professor Paul Goodwin of Train Research Center, UAL, and Trace Network, and Professor Toshio Watanabe of Train, University of East Anglia, and Trace Network. They have supported and collaborated with Tate, and particularly with this research center, in many different ways, and have played a crucial role in realizing this symposium, also as part of their Walding Public Cultures, the Arts and Social Innovation Project. I'm also grateful to Alex Farquharson, Director of Tate Britain, and David A. Bailey, who are the co-curators of Life Between Islands exhibition, for their artistic and intellectual contribution to the shaping of this symposium. My huge thanks go to Daniela Rose King, Adjunct Curator of Caribbean Diasporic Art of this research center, for her invaluable contribution throughout the project. Ose Bonsel, Curator of International Art at Tate Modern, and Emma Jones, our research manager, have played important roles at earlier stages of this preparation. And Odessa Warren, our research coordinator, along with Dan Crompton, have prepared this event with great attention to detail and care, and I feel truly grateful. My deep gratitude also go to Hyundai Motor, the research center's long-term partner, and its art lab team in particular for their continuing and generous support. Finally, I would like to thank our speakers and moderators who have been flexible and collaborative to many of our different requests and really generous with their time. I'm also grateful to all of you who has joined this event from probably all different corners of the world. You are making all our collective efforts really worthwhile. So thank you. And please join me in welcoming Paul Goodwin, who will introduce the symposium and keynote in more detail.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you for your leadership and collaboration on this amazing project. Before I introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Katherine McKittrick, I'd like to tell you a quick story. Yesterday, a momentous thing happened in the Caribbean. The pop icon Rihanna was officially made a national hero in her home country of Barbados. Now, as much as this news brought me great joy as a Rihanna fan, more important was the fact that this happened in the context of the rejection of the Queen as the new head of state, as the head of state of Barbados, sorry, the installation of a Black woman, Dame Sandra Mason, as the new head of state, and the declaration that this most ancient of British ex-colonies is now a fully independent republic. All this was in large part engineered and presided over by another dynamic Black woman, the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley. Barbados is often considered to be among the most naturally beautiful islands in the Caribbean, although other neighbors hotly dispute this. Blessed as it is by endless sumptuous coastlines, fertile soil, and plentiful and an even topography, which you can see behind me. It was these very features, of course, that attracted the British colonists to transform and divide this generous landscape into a vast grid of plantations where a new form of capitalism based on sugar production flourished in the 17th century. It was indeed in Barbados that the slavery plantation production model was invented and perfected and then exported throughout the Caribbean and beyond. The world-making transformations that ensued saw Britain become fabulously wealthy off the backs of the unfree labor of enslaved Africans and indentured workers brought from Asia. Over the next 3 days, we will be engaging in a collective conversation about the Caribbean, or rather the Caribbean in its constitutive multiplicity as complex landscapes, fragile ecologies, anti-colonial grounds, territories of resistance and healing, global hub of cultural hybridities. The Caribbean experience is a microcosm of the global modernity that we're all living through today. What Édouard Glissant calls Caribbean discourse is at the heart of the crucial questions we'll be addressing this week. How can we live together, work together, build knowledge together? Caribbean thinking, writing, and being in the world expressed by our guiding lights for this conference, as Sue mentioned, Sylvia Wynter, Stuart Hall, and Édouard Glissant, has attended to questions that coalesce around the politics and poetics of the history of the transatlantic slave trade, questions around the racial plantation capitalist system, articulations of identity and non-identity, extractivism and historical geographies of colonial exploitation, and especially in its more literary guise, a common engagement with the beguiling and mysteriously beautiful landscape of the Caribbean archipelago, the flora and fauna of the natural landscape, as well as the hurly-burly of island urban communities. These thinkers have created critical imaginaries that configure these islands as laboratories of human and cultural experience, a huge historical experiment or instruction manual in how human beings can survive, resist, and contribute to the ongoing reconfiguration of what it means to be human beyond deathly colonial understandings of man and the human forged under centuries of European domination of the planet. The title of this conference references a memorable phrase used by Édouard Glissant during his dialogues while crossing the Atlantic with the scholar Mantia Diawara. When asked by Diawara what he thought about the moment of departure when Africans were captured for the first time and put into a closed boat, Glissant responded, quote, "It's the moment when one consents not to be a single being and attempts to be many beings at the same time. In other words, for me, every diaspora is the passage from unity to multiplicity," unquote. Consent not to be a single being can be seen as an invocation of our constitutive multiplicities, opening up new modes of relation with ourselves and with the world. The conference builds on this invocation to speculate about the Caribbean, not as an abstracted place or physical location, but rather as a constellation of methods that can help us to think, live, and love in common. Otherwise, to help us to imagine, see, and relate to other worlds in our world. What does it mean then to think from, with, or through the Caribbean as method? And we're blessed this afternoon to have a keynote lecture from a scholar and thinker who has contributed so many beautiful texts and writings that speak in so many ways to the concerns that this conference engages with. Professor Katherine McKittrick's foundational work on Black geographies, with a focus on Black women as agents of geographic thinking and praxis, has opened up new lines of inquiry across Black studies, gender studies, human geography, and humanities. For example, Demonic Ground, her seminal 2006 monograph, shed light on places negotiated by Black women during and after the transatlantic slave trade, exploring the geographic implications of slave auction blocks, Harriet Jacobs' Attic, Black Canada and New France, as well as the conceptual spaces of feminism and Sylvia Wynter's philosophies. Central to McKittrick's argument are the ways in which Black women are not passive recipients of their surroundings, and how a sense of place relates to the struggle against domination. Professor McKittrick's long-time collaboration with and reading of Sylvia Wynter, one of the guiding lights of our conference, resulted in another seminal text edited by her in 2015, Sylvia Wynter on Being Human as Praxis. This critical genealogy of Wynter's work highlighted her insights on how race, location, and time together inform what it means to be human. Professor McKittrick's capacious interdisciplinarity in her research attends to the links between epistemological narrative, social justice, and creative texts. These weavings and focus on creative Black methodologies come to the fore in her most recent text, Dear Science, which came out earlier this year and really is a must read, part of which will be referred in her keynote today. Katherine McKittrick is Professor of Black Studies and Gender Studies at Queen's University in Canada. In addition to the text I already mentioned, she also co-edited with Clyde Wood's Black Geographies and the Politics of Place in 2017. Katherine's paper today is entitled Charmaine's Wire, The Planetary Humanism, Paul Gilroy, Édouard Glissant, and Sylvia Wynter. Now, before we see and hear Katherine's paper, can I remind you to please use the Q&A function to post your questions for Katherine. After her lecture, we'll have some time for questions and a conversation. So can I remind you as well that the first panel today following this keynote will be Human as Praxis from 5 to 6:30 UK time. So please log in and stay for that. Katherine, on behalf of all the organizers of this conference, I'd like to express a huge thank you and gratitude for kindly accepting our invitation to speak to us today. So the floor is to Katherine. Can we please hear from her? Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Odessa. Thank you, Paul, for introducing this conversation and continuing it. My paper is called Charmaine's Wires, and I'm going to begin with a very short guide quote from Aimé Césaire. I am on very bad terms with space. I am on very bad terms with time, Césaire. I begin this paper with endings from a series of texts by Paul Gilroy as a way to begin a conversation about how ecology and environment in Black studies reorder our sense of time and place. The endings I share show that planetary humanism is a framework through which to observe ecological, geographic, and environmental processes, while also paying attention to the complexities of diaspora time. The Black Atlantic ends with reference to sustainability, intractable poverty, and overdevelopment. Between Camps ends with reference to multiple ecologies, climatic conditions, differential environmental histories. The last chapter of There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack refers to large-scale structural unemployment, the expansion of nuclear power, the rise of new technologies and communicative networks. The final essay in Darker Than Blue situates nature as a resource of and for hope. The textual endings illuminate the connections between humanity and physiography or physical geographies. These endings are not presented as resolutions, but instead prompt us to consider how Gilroy's larger project, which undoes the promise that geographic identification will lead to an ethical mode of racial belonging, is actually tied to environmental well-being. In this way, we can understand Gilroy's planetary humanism as an extension of the prevailing themes that so often define his research and writing. Specifically, identity, place, race, nation, diaspora, and belonging hold a special place in critical uptakes of his work. What often goes missing are how these concepts are tied to environment, ecology, and nature. Indeed, as I've argued elsewhere, physiography, especially watery and wavy geographies, are central to his thinking. One cannot read the Black Atlantic without wandering into the materiality of the ocean and ocean waves. One cannot fully capture this text without the brutalities of the Middle Passage and slave ships and waves and rebellions, acting as the infrastructure to the larger argument. As we wander through his writings, we also move through what Gilroy has described as offshore humanism and confront Black Atlantic logics that are recalibrated as a sense of place, in a different sense of place, and bring into sharp focus how maritime geographies, pelagic zones function in relation to displacement, belonging, and our collective interhuman relationships. These endings can act as conceptual openings and allow us to think about how race, as an analytical category, is nested within and informs physical geographies. What comes to mind immediately are environmental racism, environmental injustices, the racialized contours of pollution havens, toxic dumping grounds, and other forms of garbage imperialism. We notice that resource extraction, land grabbing, food insecurity, dirty water boiling advisories, drought, desertification, and the depletion of insects, wildlife, and vegetation are expressions of colonialism and race thinking. There is extensive scholarship that explores and exposes how vulnerable and marginalized communities experience and live through environmental racism. Made up of many debates and insights, what we can glean from this work is that racism is enacted spatially. Racism is an ideology and a set of oppressive actions, both of which coalesce to impact upon physical and human geographies. Multiple organizations and corporations, including different levels of government, are invested in and profit from various economic processes that harm, abandon, forget, extract from, and displace vulnerable communities and their geographies. These kinds of conversations that are raised under the broad umbrella of environmental racism and environmental injustice not only demonstrate that nature and society are entwined, they also map out sites of environmental disaster, environmental decline, thus cartographically delineating how health and wellness are spatialized unevenly, and how place-based inequities are punctuated by racism. It's also important to note that some literatures that attend to environmental injustices are imperfect. There's a tendency, for example, to posit that vulnerable communities are composed of toxic bodies, with Black people exemplifying the ultimate toxicity, and thus providing an ideal analytical script that proves, rather than calls into question, the brutality of environmental racism. Indeed, we are all aware that the tendency to conceptualize non-white people and the land together as one is a crude and dehumanizing expression of scientific racism. When race and environmental decline conceptually collide, this biocentric argument holds, and we read that passive Black flesh is inscribed by or represented as ecology, or that Black bodies, not Black people, are the receptacles of noxious substances and thus become, through osmosis, toxic landscapes. Here we witness not an assertion of capacious Black livingness that lives in concert with non-Black communities and extra-human processes and environments, but instead the argument that Black bodies are like poison, Black bodies are like geology, Black bodies are waste, Black bodies are toxic. Sometimes an important counter-argument is posed. Studies of geology or ecology are white and Eurocentric, the argument goes, so let's posit that geology and ecology are Black. Often, though not always, this counter-argument authenticates and bifurcates racial differences, while also falling back on the idea that Blackness is the dumping ground for environmental waste. Of course, Black activism and Black organizing sometimes emerge as part of these conversations and this kind of scholarship. But what is often taken up, what we see and what is emphasized and always illuminated, is environmental catastrophe enveloping already oppressed Black bodies. The preoccupation with describing subjugated bodies is suffocating. Both the environment and the racialized body become a singular analytic site of degradation. Biological determinism is normalized and spatialized, and conversations that draw attention to relational and transnational eco-crises and fighting these transnational eco-crises, these conversations are foreclosed. I'm not minimizing environmental racism and the way it negatively impacts upon marginalized communities in very violent and material ways, and I'm not foreclosing activist work by Black and other communities that's related to the environment and environmental catastrophe. Instead, I'm raising questions about methodology in scholarship about Black geographies, Black ecologies, and Blackness and the environment. I believe it's important to repeatedly signal that when dehumanization is the central theoretical frame, if the method is to describe and prove racism, it will probably lead to the conclusion that Black people are less than human. If the method is to describe and prove racism, Black people become analytical objects that prove that Black people are less than human. The lesson we can learn from some of these analytical pitfalls is that we must carefully work through the racial underpinnings of ecological crises, which can inadvertently or intentionally legitimize dehumanization. Our concerns with the environment should not result in degrading Black humanity. For this reason, I'm drawn to interdisciplinary studies that spend time thinking about the connections between physical geography and human geography. For me, this is exemplified well by many thinkers, but today I'll focus on the work of Sylvia Wynter, Édouard Glissant, and Paul Gilroy, because their work stands out as generously reordering the methodological, temporal, and analytical stakes of liberation. Indeed, it is their work that inspires us to imagine the human as relational to and embedded in physiography without privileging calcified colonial categories and patterns. In this way, their versions of humanism are not simply a stance or a perspective or a framework, but also ways of doing and living the world. In my writing, I've called this Black Atlantic livingness and Black livingness, or following Wynter, we might think of this as being human as praxis. What is notable for me and what is worth paying attention to and what I keep returning to in my work is that this is not a humanism that functions to name something, but it is instead a method of Black life. As I noted at the beginning of this presentation, Gilroy offers us a way to think about how belonging can be understood in relation to physical geography. He teaches us to pay close attention to the uneven and multiple geographies of nationalism and xenophobia, and notices the ways in which Black diasporic cultures have the potential to and do breach these geographies. In Between Camps, he makes meaningful connection between transatlantic slavery, climate, time, biological determinism, and environmental determinism. This insight is similar to, but does not twin, Sylvia Wynter's observation that plantation slavery is the foundation to environmental injustice and climate catastrophe. Wynter asks us to think through how the transport of Africans during slavery and the extractive economies of plantation slavery and colonialism have over time normalized both racism and ecocide. Taking a different tack, Glissant begins Poetics of Relation with the open boat. He names the economized expression of racial violence as a non-history that unravels into a stunning and provocative critique of filial geographies. One way to take up these observations is to suggest that the authors are, in different ways, offering a teleological explanation or a linear explanation that ties racist histories to contemporary forms of environmental racism. The argument could be made that there's a direct line between the race thinking of slavery and our contemporary environmental predicament. I think in some ways, yes, we must address how plantation economies, which included the commodification of Black people, provided the conditions for contemporary forms of land exploitation and racial violence. However, this leap across time risks situating Black people within a specific historical frame and pushes them forward into the present with time, personhood, space, and other factors ostensibly unchanged. This kind of argument mistreats the complexities of Black time by obscuring Black time. It also analytically represses or undermines rebellion, multiplicity, relationality, temporal interruptions, and Black life, because it is an argument that can only make sense by privileging non-personhood as a kind of origin story. I suspect, in fact, that the leap across time leads to the toxic bodies I mentioned just a little bit earlier. It's for this reason I think it's necessary to be cautious about how we attend to the connections between slavery and the present, because these two very different modalities and temporalities are sometimes mobilized as an analytical pathway that conflate the past and the present. This conflation posits that nothing has changed when we know in our hearts that much has changed. We know that racism and empire and capitalism, or more specifically, those living beings who invest in and profit from exploitation and organized abandonment. We know that these processes of racial capitalism are continually finding new ways to destroy our worlds. My problem is not with thinking through the past and the present, but rather with the ways in which slave time propels a kind of teleological or linear time machine that captures a permanent and authentic Black history and pushes that past across time, seemingly unchanged. I wager that this kind of time machine is utilized and reproduced because of a preoccupation with describing degraded Black humanity that is then folded into profitable academic learning objectives that seek to validate degraded Black humanity. At the same time, the time machine is utilized and reproduced because we must in some way respond to racial terror and work out why and how the past seems to be repeating itself, even though we know in our hearts that much has changed. We know in our hearts that those in power are always finding new ways to oppress us. This is a terrible predicament, but I suspect that how we respond to racial terror can sometimes keep in place a knowledge system that does not allow us to see in the present Black life for what it was then and Black life for what it is now, and therefore in the future. Even though we cannot see clearly, this knowledge system paradoxically demands a false clarity and thus clings to Black objecthood as a way to verify itself. This false clarity is marketable. Black objecthood is academic currency. The time machine folds Black time into prevailing temporalities, linear temporalities, and the verification of objecthood is reinforced as we reproduce the obligations of racial observance. I guess what I'm saying is that our attachment to market time is underpinned by what Gilroy calls a theater of history that is accentuated by racial hierarchies. Our methodologies and scholarly questions can be negatively shaped by market time, by capitalism. Our attachment to market time can suspend liberation. And in concert with physiography, our attachment to market time harms precisely because it reifies a belief system that, as Frantz Fanon notes, sways between atomic and spiritual disintegration. So one of our collective tasks is to work through how race thinking, racial terror, physical geography, if they analytically adhere to market time, enunciate multi-scalar human and extra-human unfreedoms by annihilating Black time and Black space. To return to Gilroy, Wynter, and Glissant, I think they work through a different kind of temporal history. I do not think they present us with the Middle Passage or the plantation or the slave ship as exacting, forward-moving explanations for our contemporary global crises. However, I do think the history of slavery and its infrastructures are relevant to their work. So what are we left with? Glissant, Wynter, and Gilroy use method to reimagine how we attend to the thorny relationships between race and environment. The methodology is not a template that one applies to an analytical site, so it's not top-down theoretical framework that we then apply to deforestation or something like that, an analytical site or an archive. The methodology is a way of doing intellectual work that both holds onto and releases the living memory of slavery. This means that we must take that history of imperialism, indentureship, colonialism, and slavery and put them to work so as to avoid the pitfalls of liberal monohumanism, or the humanism Glissant writes, where idiots get trapped. The nuance here is important because they are asking that we work with the knotted and relational underpinnings of colonial plantation histories rather than beginning with and moving away from the crude categorizations imposed by Eurocentric modernity and its practitioners. In forefronting the complexities of Black humanity and reorienting the history of Blackness outside the logics of racism, their sense of time becomes sinuous and unpredictable rather than linear. Their insights uniquely notice how we enter into history, which is tied to how we analytically and experientially grapple with the racial underpinnings of geography. And this teaches us the brutal limits of conflating land and blood, and therefore conflating time and space. This reordering of time is an analytical and methodological gift. It allows us to recalibrate our relationship with the environment by teaching us how to read physiography as both relational to Black humanity and a location of anti-colonial possibility that does not reify racial authenticities. This is difficult intellectual work. It is a hard vision to sustain precisely because they are asking that we respond to ongoing practices of racial violence and other forms of oppression, including environmental catastrophe, as connected but not conflated. They ask us to learn from Black intellectual labor without essentializing Blackness or other racial identifications. And part of this is a lesson in understanding that the regime of racial terror perfected during plantation slavery provided the conditions to totally rethink our racial attachments in the present. The rethinking notices that the fallout of transatlantic slavery, the historically present wreckage of colonialism, can include the absolute refusal of territory and territorialization. The rethinking requires that our relationship to land be, to borrow from Gilroy, restless and moody. What you see is an ongoing critique of geography as the basis for belonging that extends to our environmental well-being. In this way, the question of physiography or physical geography and what we do with race environment analytically has less to do with drawing a line between the past and the present, and more to do with how the brutalities of the past provide a new or different analytics of belonging. It's worth repeating that this is not a question of dishonoring the history of enslavement or contemporary forms of racism, but instead a plea to work with what history gave us, which is, as Frantz Fanon would write, a new humanism, and by extension, as seen in the work of Gilroy, Wynter, and Glissant, a re-enchanted humanism, a planetary humanism, an aesthetics of disruption and intrusion. In this way, how we relate to each other and how we relate to our ecologies and environments and extra-human physiographies is not a system of thought per se, but a way of living. This is a long way of saying that I believe Glissant, Wynter, and Gilroy offer a reading practice. They offer ways of reading. I really want to emphasize here that I'm not focusing on what they write, although it's super important, but I'm not focusing so much on what they write as much as I'm focusing on how they teach us to read. This is, for me, one of the more meaningful ways to engage in right Black studies and what Gilroy calls planetary humanism. And it should be continually thought through, enacted, revisited, and revised. To understand planetary humanism as a lesson, rather than a series of descriptions, opens up immense analytical possibilities wherein Black humanity and Black livingness, under the strain of objecthood and geographies of distress, provide us with clues to read, live, and inhabit this world outside the logics of white supremacy. Put otherwise, if we are committed to envisioning and living a humanism made to the measure of the world, that's Cesar, a planetary humanism, radical reading practices in part make that world possible. The work of scholars such as Édouard Glissant and Wynter are lessons in how we can theorize and perhaps more fully realize our planetary hopes. This means that we must enter into time differently and position our intellectual work as an unsettled practice that is committed to teaching and learning, or as Glissant says, giving on and with, rather than a series of static descriptive statements that seamlessly move across time and space. This is an especially challenging pedagogy because we know that things have changed, but we know that we do not have the language to express this change because it's grounded in a familiarity we did not and do not live. This unfamiliarity is, I'm suggesting, an invitation to learn rather than to know totally. This is, I think, the under-acknowledged gift of planetary humanism, the lesson to live and read differently and enter into a conversation about our collective interhuman and extrahuman ecologies as curious beings. The lesson is to share an analytic that is committed to undoing harm rather than repeatedly describing harm. The lesson is to sit with and learn from Black time without privileging racial authenticities. In a larger forthcoming research program, I'm returning to the untidy connections between race and physiography, paying close attention to what Black poetic ecologies do to our sense of time. For now, I briefly turn to wires, Charmaine's wires and bees. Charmaine Lerch's artist portfolio includes giant wire sculptures of bees. The wires are bundled and form thick and heavy landscapes. Wires hold ecoskeletons and wings together. The giant wire sculptures cast shadows. Lerch studied the work of and had conversations with bee specialist Lawrence Packer at York University in Toronto, Canada. She explored local species of bees, primarily those in Ontario, Canada, and she made each wire sculpture correspond with different bee types. For example, the tri-colored bumblebee is made with mixed copper and black wire. The sweat bee is made with green wool and mixed wire. The cuckoo bee is made with red and brown wool and mixed wire. Diasporic literacy and the lessons that Wynter, Glissant, and Gilroy provide for us allow us to notice how Lerch connects Black life to ecological matter, drawing attention to human and environmental relationalities. Specifically, we can recall the bees in Beloved, in Eva's Man, in Their Eyes Were Watching God. We remember the bees invoked by hip hop artists Little Kim and Missy Elliott. We come across the distracting bees in Teju Cole and John Keane. We can then move through some scientific narratives, pollination, bee dances and communication, wax and honey production, hives, colonies, eusocial labor and cooperation, and nests buried deep in the soil. Bees are ancient insects and planetary insects. We read that honeybees probably arrived in North America in the 1600s alongside colonization, alongside slavery, alongside extraction and agricultural production, alongside settlements and reserves and plantations. We also read that honeybees were not the first bees in North America. The bees measure our history of violence and expand that history outside of itself. The bees do not have the same rhythm as colonial time. They can be tracked, yet at the same time inhabit worlds we cannot temporally grasp. We read that some bees are endangered, that endangerment signifies our present monumental eco-crises. The wire materials that Lerch uses complement this. Metal bendable tubes, the wires allow us to link art worlds to metals, and thus to computer hard drives, vascular stents, data cables, piano strings, guitar strings, fences. In the wire, we are given finance, empire, environmental decay, exploitation, and enclosure. In wire, we are given sound. Lurch's bees are an expression of an expansive and unfinished planetary relationality that express interhuman and extrahuman entanglements. When thought about alongside the valuable lessons imparted by Wynter, Glissant, and Gilroy, the bees can be conceptualized as non-human objects and insect worlds that are tied to a range of human actions and held together by wire, wool, and narrative. As curiosity, the bees are lessons through which we become agentive learners and listeners and readers. Rather than simply dwelling on what the bees are at the level of description, we can understand these wired sculptures as prompts that readjust and refine our relationship with physiography, while also leaving room for wonder. We could be mystified with how Black the bees are, particularly given their symbolic currency in African-American popular culture. We could posit that they are metaphors for Black humanity and sociality. We could follow a line that begins with bee migration and colonialism and ends with extinction. We could as well use them as evidence of pre-colonial nostalgia. These themes are full of possibility, but they are also laden with limitations, particularly temporally. I wonder, therefore, if the wire bees might instead give us permission to bring some of these narratives together, discard a few and add a few as well. What if we give the bees a non-linear history? They might, at least for a moment, ward off the desire to conflate environment and race, which is accentuated by the unkind allure of territorialization. It might allow us to refuse the celebration and emptiness of those race metaphors that are excised of experience and material lives. It might too deny the currency that comes with describing environmental racism as Black subordination and violation. Maybe the bees can't be captured. The uncaptured brings us back to the collaborative and open-ended wonder that uncovers planetary humanism as a dynamic pedagogy and a way of being, rather than a downward pressing narrative. Refusing the stasis of noun, planetary humanism as verb, as lesson, as an interruption in time, as a readjustment to how we use historical categories, positions our interhuman and interecological predicament as one that necessitates cooperative listening and reading. This planetary humanism of doing, a humanism of practice and action and collaboration rather than a humanism of description, brings into sharp focus a way of being human, a mode of Black Atlantic livingness where the work of liberation is not just a set of ideas, but a way of teaching and showing each other how to live the world anew. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for an incredibly inspiring paper, which has so much there that we can unpack and kind of delve into. So thank you so much for that, Katherine. It's such a beautiful paper in the way that it combines different disciplines, different understandings of methodology, theory, reading, the list goes on. What I think we're going to do now, Katherine, we're going to have maybe a little bit of conversation as we wait for some questions to merge. I'll be tracking sort of questions as we go along. But I guess I wanted to kind of start, as I mentioned to you before, with a question that comes up, or an idea that comes up in our discussions in the Worlding Public Cultures Project about this notion of worlding. And it's quite a problematic notion, because we know that it comes from European philosophy, particularly Heidegger, and has obviously a very Eurocentric kind of grounding, but yet it does touch on this notion of the world. I mean, in the paper, you kind of foreground Gilroy's planetary humanism and the idea of the planetary in the way that it kind of grounds the relationship between ideas, thoughts, philosophy, and environment. particularly in the context of Black studies. So I just wondered whether worlding, which we in our discussions have had many problems with, right? And we're still we're staying with the trouble, in a way, with it. We haven't jettisoned it yet, but we're struggling with it. I wonder whether how it figures in your thinking, if at all.
Well, I don't use, you can hear me, yeah, okay. I don't use the term worlding. That I don't think I have used it at all, but I think it's a great term because, as you said, it sort of signals the trouble of Europeanness, but also provides a way for us to think about connections between the self and the environment and so on and so forth. One of the things that I think that thinkers like Gilroy and Wynter and Glissant allow us to, what they encourage us to do is to not abandon European thinking, right? They make very, very clear that modernity is not just about, you know, the distinct differences between Black and non-Black communities, for example. They tell us it's messy. They tell us that how we inhabit geography and how we relate to each other is uncomfortable and awful, and that transatlantic slavery, indentureship, and colonialism provided that awfulness. And so if we think about worlding in that way through the terrible encounter that pushed us together and produced something new, then we can do something new with it. And that's what I think is really, really significant. And you know, you can see in Wynter's work, for example, and we'll probably see this emerge through the conference a little bit, but you see her talking about the struggle to talk about Heidegger with Black folks who want to abandon Heidegger, and she's very interested in sort of what kind of ideas are out there in European philosophy, although she never calls herself a philosopher, which is, you know, something important to keep in mind. But what kind of ideas allow us to imagine freedom in new ways, Black and non-Black, right? So I think that there's a lot of, as I said in the paper, a lot of lessons here from these particular types of thinkers. And so one of the things I like about worlding is that it is a verb, right? And so that means that not only means it's challenging the stasis of geography, it also means that we can do something with it, right? If it's a verb, it's flexible and shifting and uncomfortable. So, yeah.
No, thank you. I mean, yeah, I think these kinds of terms and concepts, sometimes that we kind of get into these kinds of binary modes of thinking where we kind of reject certain terms or certain ideas because they're Eurocentric or they seem to be coming from a different tradition. But it seems to me that what you're talking about, this kind of capacious Black Atlantic livingness, this form of praxis, this form of reading or being attentive to reading, tends to be much more open in that way. And it's quite interesting in terms of the way that you talked about, in a way, you kind of critiqued some of the kind of prevailing notions in Black studies around description and, you know, description of suffering and the afterlives of slavery, which perhaps is associated with ideas around Afro-pessimism, etc., and that kind of quite rigid or linear understanding of time, or this kind of time machine as you describe it. And it's interesting to think about how perhaps some of these archaic terms, such as worlding, may actually be useful in some way. But I wanted to just kind of come back, and there are questions coming through, so I'll definitely, this will be my last question before we kind of go into some of the questions from the audience. But the focus on method in your work, Katherine, which comes across in so much, particularly in Dear Science, but in other work, I just where you situate that into the debates around Black studies, because you kind of method is not just an academic thing. It expands beyond that. It goes beyond just reading and writing. It's about how we live.
Yeah, you know, one of the confessions that I share when I'm talking about methodology is that my PhD dissertation didn't have a methods chapter. And I remember walking into the defense and just being so just all realizing that at the defense. Obviously there was a method in there, but it wasn't written as such. But I became increasingly interested in what methodology can do because of that absence. And sort of this compulsion to fill in that absence after the defense. And what I noticed, I think, and what you see across Black studies is this inability to do disciplined work. You see this. You see whether whether someone's coming from a discipline like sociology or geography, whether they're coming from physics or whatever, they can't not throw in, for example, reference to a hip hop song, or they so they do what Du Bois did, which is the beginning. There's always the sorrow songs are always there for Black people throughout their work, regardless of the discipline. They sneak it in footnotes, or they do more capacious and rigorous interdisciplinary work. And part of that work is to develop and talk about the beautiful relationship that Black people have with creative texts, and to use creative texts not just as objects of study, but as informing the theoretical framework. And so for me, that I learned a lot of that from Sylvia Wynter, who was trained as a dancer, as we know. And I've asked myself this question. I've never explicitly asked her this, but I wonder if she would be the scholar she is if she hadn't been trained in dancing as a dancer, as a playwright, as a novelist. So I wonder how the creative text allows us to think about Black studies in really beautiful and rigorous ways that really unsettle scholarly knowledge, and the kind of the dryness of it. And as I said, and I'll end here, but I think this is the gift of Black studies to me. What I did is I just kind of looked and I saw it everywhere, and then wrote about it. So it's like a gift that I was given that I would like to talk about. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The questions are kind of flooding in. They're a bit like a London bus, right? They don't come for ages, and then when they do come, they all come at the same time. So let's quickly, we've got about 10 or so minutes. Let's quickly go into some of them. So one question is about I was wondering how Katherine personally defines Blackness. Is it something inherited genealogically, or is it perhaps something more complex?
Blackness is a signal, I think, or a signifying category that's flexible. I think that, and that's how I define Blackness. I think I really want to be cautious of sort of relying too heavily on race thinking to define Blackness, because we will get into a conversation, and then going down the road, and we'll be a place where we're sort of just reifying racial authenticities. And so the question is actually a perfect question, because it's about Blackness and not Black people or Black, So I think that's how I would define Blackness, as a signifier for a way of living that is uncomfortable and messy. And I'll add to that I think it's really, really important that if we look at the work of Du Bois, if we look at the work of Wynter, Fanon, that it is the conundrum, it is the problem of Blackness that provides the conditions for them to launch these monumental critiques of modernity, and follow that with a critique of Blackness as an authenticating signifier, right? And so this is the complicated work of what Blackness can do, where the problem of Blackness provides the conditions for the critique, and the critique itself is refusing what Gilroy calls the dismal dance of authenticity, which is my favorite term by him, and I say probably once a day.
It's a beautiful term. So questions are flooding in, and the good news is that I've been told we can extend a little bit, Katherine, if that's okay with you, so we can hopefully get through them. So there's a question from my colleague Ming Tiampo. She says, "Thank you for that brilliant paper. I'm curious about your advocacy for a humanism of action and practice, and was wondering if you could expand a bit on what spheres of action and practice you imagine. In the World in Public Cultures project, we think about our work within practices of public culture, which we think of in terms of pedagogies, curatorial practices, and data practices. So I guess it's a question about how you would think about action and practice or praxis within wider spheres."
Thank you for the question, a beautiful question. I would follow your, I would follow exactly, at what you just mentioned. For me, praxis is about teaching and learning. I think that and not in an academic setting necessarily, but as a pedagogy and as an activity where we're generating ideas and sharing ideas. Praxis is always collaborative for me, and I think it's always collaborative for anti-colonial thinkers. You can't do it alone. You have to have a conversation at least with one person about your ideas, even if you're a loner, like myself a little bit. And so for me, that's the key to, those are some of the ways I think about praxis. And I also think that creative activity, so the song, the beat, the groove, our relationship with visual arts, allow us to think about how praxis, or allow us to think about our relationship between the creative text and ourselves and our communities, how these generate activity. And so if you know a little bit about my work, I'm really, really interested in how we respond to great music physiologically, and how Black music has given us another kind of gift to notice that the creative text is a narrative that is a creative narrative that is beautiful and amazing and engaging, but that it also has the capacity to move us, to have the capacity to move us. And we don't have to tell anybody about how it moves us or why it's moving us or why we love it or why we hate it. Doesn't matter. But the point is that it has the capacity to move us. And so for me, that's another kind of praxis where you see a different kind of collaboration between the creative text and the social, I guess is how I'd say it. So that's a long way of saying yes, in the same way that you posed the question is how I think about praxis and activity.
Thank you so much, Katherine. There's quite a few questions coming in about practice and practice. One question from Maria Elena Maruda is, you distinguish between action and description. How do you understand this difference? Maybe elaborate a little bit more.
Sure. So description for me, I mean, when I'm talking about description, I'm mostly talking about academic or scholarly work that describes a analytical site or describes a set of describes data that has been collected. So for me, I want to be clear that that's how, and it's not super clear in any of my work. So it's something I've been thinking about post Dear Science, that description, when I talk about description and how description is not liberation and things like that, I'm really talking about the ways that academic frameworks are invested in describing different kinds and types of oppression. And so in my own work, and this comes through in geography, like, I'm going to collect data on where Black people live, and then I'm going to write a paper on how they live in the poor area of town, right? And that's what Black geography is. And for me, that doesn't capture what Black geographies are. What Black geographies are actions, are activities, are constantly crossing boundaries or blurring boundaries or redefining what that geography is within itself. And so there's an example of what description is. They live there, they're poor, and activity, what they're doing, how they're reimagining geography, how they're thinking about liberation. And you see this constantly, you know, this is why I'm so attracted to geography, because it usually, for me, it usually is Black people who are completely unsettling what we think we know about space and place through placemaking practices, which are quite radical, and kind of refuse that stasis or that description that tends to enclose them.
As you mentioned geography, I wanted to quickly slip in a quick question of my own, and I'll definitely come back to the questions. You mentioned geography, and my reading of geography back in the day when I used to do quite a bit of reading around geography, particularly around Marxist geographies, or people like Henri Lefebvre, Production Space, David Harvey, Uneven geographies. I wonder where does the discipline, where do those kinds of geographies, Marxist geographies, geographies of capitalism, the uneven distribution of space. You mentioned about the annihilation of Black time, which kind of reminds me of the phrase of David Harvey, the annihilation of space by time. Where does that work sit within discussions around Black geographies? Does Black geographies, you know, inhabit that central space, or does it explode it and go beyond?
I think it does both. I think it's really, really important to nod to the work of Bobby Wilson, Clyde Woods, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who are kind of Black Marxist geographers, right? And so they have this, their corpus is very, very committed to thinking through the political economy of space and place in relation to Black folks. And so there is a relationship between Marxist geographies and Black geographies. I think there's an inextricable link there, actually, if we track how they think about space and place, how they sort of, I would argue, develop the sub discipline of Black geographies without saying it. And you know, and I think the other thing I would add is in Clyde Woods's brilliant work, but you see this in Ruthie's work in terms of storytelling, but in Clyde's work, it is connected to Black music and music making. And so there is a tethering between the creative and the political economy of space and place. So there's definitely a connection there. And in my work, I was really indebted to Neil Smith's work. I came at it through the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And I was like, this conceptualization of deep space is really, really useful for thinking about crisis in relation to Black geographies. So there's a lot there, I think.
Katherine, we're getting a lot of questions coming through. We've got about 15 minutes, but we'll try and get as many as we can done. There's two questions about planetary humanism and your understanding of planetary humanism. One is, does planetary humanism require the disavowal and even the denunciation of religion? So planetary humanism and religion. And then the other one by Cecilia Fajardo-Hill is, how can we think about the notion of Afrofuturism in relation to planetary humanism? So there's one question around religion and planetary humanism, and the other around Afrofuturism.
So I'm not sure how to answer the first question, so I'll answer it the best I can. One of the ways to think about planetary humanism is, or I would say is to maybe think about it alongside a re-enchanted humanism. So there we would bring in Sylvia Wynter. There we would bring in her ongoing work on Christianity, on different kinds and types of belief systems. But one of the things that we have to notice about her work in relation to humanism are the ways in which belief systems are alterable and provide us with new pathways to think about the planet or planetary humanism or a re-enchanted humanism in new ways. So not to kind of get stuck and preoccupied with a critique of religion, but instead think about it as an opening. So here we might think about it through the question of spirituality. I would also think about it in relation to the work of someone like Ashon Crawley, who thinks about Black religious studies as almost unspeakable. And it's not something that's easily definable, but is rather instead like is a sound. And he links it to sound studies. So I think I would go a number of ways with that, but I personally don't think that that's a really good answer. I do know that there is a lot of really interesting work on Wynter's work and religious studies, of which I'm tasked to write an afterword for a book that thinks about these very questions in relation to the environment. So that's really, I think, important too. But I don't have a great answer for that. In terms of Afrofuturism, so for me, where does it fit? It fits this is for me, and I think Afrofuturism for me is contested and difficult because the concept implies implies a linear sort of framework of a future that follows the present. And I don't necessarily think it's conceptualized that way, but I think that that's sort of offhandedly what happens when we think about Afrofuturism. So we'll think about Sun Ra, or we'll think about, and this kind of thing. So for me, Afrofuturism kind of demands that we pull the future into the present and into the past, always when we're thinking it through. How do we use Afrofuturism not as something that is to come, but as something that is already happening? And that doesn't mean that we don't have a future to come. Of course we do. But I think analytically, we have to hold on to the ways in which Black, especially creative thinkers, but not just, have been asking us to think about Afrofuturism outside market time. I think that's really, really important. So that for me is a strategy for how I think about Afrofuturism. Yeah, and I worry, otherwise we're all of a sudden Black people are robots again, in the future. And then, if it's a linear thing and then it's eerily familiar. So what do we do? What do Afrofuturists, particularly creative texts, how do they allow us to, I'm going to say it, fuck with time in a different kind of way?
Great. Your talk and your answers are inspiring a whole series of questions and debates in the text in the Q&A. So yeah, we'll try and get through some of these. There's a question from artist Rhea Store. Says, thank you for the talk. I was really struck by the way that you talked about not conflating histories of enslavement, which treat Black subjects as bodies, into a methodology for present day. What do you think film could contribute as a medium or methodology? I'm very interested in Black experimental cinema, and I'm thinking about what a film could be that embraces an unpredictable timeline or is non-linear. Also that there's a weird fetishization of slave narratives in commercial feature films, which I think does the harm that you're talking about. Yeah.
I'll do my best to answer your question, Rhea. I think that so for me, this is about reading practices again. I think, I would begin with histories of enslavement that treat Black subjects as bodies. Well, I don't think the history of enslavement is about Black bodies, it's about Black people. And so if we begin by thinking about slavery, if we begin by thinking about slavery in ways where we don't assume that Black people are just commodities, but instead are, rich human beings with a commitment to liberation. If we begin with that premise, then we won't fall into the trap of kind of reproducing that story at a later date, where all of a sudden we're back to talking about oppressed bodies. So for me, the history of the important thing about the afterlife of slavery, or I prefer the living memory of slavery, is to recognize the full humanity, the category of full humanness within the enslaved, like with it, as we conceptualize the enslaved, as we talk about the enslaved, as we theorize that history. In terms of film, this is one that will stump me because I'm not a film scholar. But as I said, again, reading practices, the commercialization of those films, I don't generally watch them. I'm thinking about like 12 Years a Slave, or even, the re-upping of Beloved and things like that. So I don't think that we should we should avoid these films, but instead, how do we teach ourselves and our students how to read them? How do we engage with the commercialization of enslavement? That's the most important thing to me, is not really to abandon the creative text, but to ask ourselves what we can do with it, so that we can narrate it in a different kind of way. And that will include a critique of the commercialization, right? I think that that's part of the story. And yeah, so what does it do? I mean, this is the big question of Sylvia Wynter. What does it do, rather than what is it? And in terms, yeah, and so the other question that you had was about, how to, or what kinds of experimental films might allow us to undo the linearity of this kind of process. I'm thinking of the Black British, I'm not going to remember their name. It's a collective of people, with the scholar who wrote that canonical paper on Afrofuturism.
The Otolith Group.
Yeah, the Otolith Group.
Yeah.
They do interesting work around film, around thinking about linearity. They have a film on Drexia, which is, I think, really important. So what are other folks doing? What kinds of conversations are they having? How are they playing with time? How are they giving us a pedagogy and a practice? And that's a different kind of collaboration, where we're learning from other folks who have provided models, and then we can move forward from there. And that's not a great answer. As I said, I'm not a film scholar, but I hope it's helpful.
That's great. I mean, the Otolith Group actually has a work in the exhibition at Tate Britain, Life Between Islands, and also Rhea Storr, who asked the question, is a filmmaker and artist, has a work in the World in Public Culture's film program, which
Wonderful.
is on the website. I think the link is already in the chat.
Nice.
So a few more questions, although there are many, so unfortunately we won't be able to get to all of them, but there's a few questions about Black time. One is by Shilpi Chandra. Can you talk a bit further about the link between market time and Black time, whether we need to reject one in order to enter into the other?
Thanks, Shilpi. I don't think we do. I think the important thing for us to do is to sit with sit in time, and notice different conceptualizations of time, and notice how we enter into market time differently than other folks. I don't think we can sort of claw apart market time and Black time. I don't think that, and I don't think it's useful to do it, because I don't think that we will. That's almost like saying, like in a way, it might be similar to saying there's only Black modernity, or there's only Eurocentric modernity, instead of sort of thinking through how questions of time and space and Blackness and non-Blackness inform each other. So for this, I think that I don't think you reject one for the other. Instead, you sit with market time, you notice what Black time does within the context of market time, and vice versa. And, and to follow Kara Keeling's wonderful discussion of Frantz Fanon, we wait, sometimes we wait and see what happens. We wait for decolonization, we wait for the anti-colonial moment. And so it is the enmeshment of market time and Black time that provide us with the clues about how to prepare for rebellion, for revolution, the kinds of rebellion and revolution that we need at these particular moments. So that's how I would, that's how I would think about that.
Thank you so much. Probably two more questions, and I'm going to sort of pick one out. This one is a question for asking for advice for younger scholars. Florence wanted to follow up on the undisciplined nature of Black studies and how one can sneak it into their work. She's wondering if there is any advice for younger scholars, for example, PhD students in a discipline who want to start or center Black studies frameworks in their work, but must engage with the canons and expectations of their disciplines.
Yeah, this is the question I get. I get this question a lot. The best thing to do is to get an amazingly supportive supervisor and committee. The most important thing about your PhD work is having a supervisor that's open to you pairing the disciplined canon with other conversations, whether they be in Black studies, Indigenous studies, anti-colonial studies, whatever. So for me, that's the most important process in terms of how to get through graduate school. It's extremely important. As I said, there are other ways to sneak it in. I think that there are other ways to engage with Black studies, centering it. I think it differs from student to student and committee to committee. But I do think it's important to find a way. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to sneak it in? Do you know what I'm saying? But if you do, what do your footnotes look like? What do your comprehensive exams look like, or your qualifying exams? Those types of things, I think. For me, I did a degree in Black Studies without having a Black Studies degree. I did it all on my own time. I had one Black professor in my graduate work. I didn't have any up to that point. I had one Black professor, and otherwise I read Gilroy on my own and with friends and with colleagues. So the other way is to do it through reading groups. You set them up. Find colleagues who want to read this work with you outside the university setting. So I think there are a number of ways that you can approach it. But if you're right in that academic world and you're like totally committed to doing that PhD, make sure that you have the support of faculty, ideally, who can ideally say go for it, right? If you're doing physics but you must read Beloved, do it. Right? I think that's the best way to negotiate that.
Catherine, thank you so much. We've got so many more questions here. We've got Kodjo Eshen from the Oslo group on here.
What? Oh my God.
We've got so many things going on. Unfortunately, we do have to close because we have another session. But what I would like to suggest is that we will collect the questions and make them available on our website, on the WPC website, and perhaps come back to you, Catherine, at some point about maybe addressing them. But listen, I wanted to thank you for the generosity and capaciousness of your presentation, and also your Q&A, which is really so useful to a wide variety of the people that are listening here, and also to myself. So thank you so much, Catherine. It's a wonderful start to the symposium. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the change of thought that you've put into motion about Black methodologies, etc., could really resonate across the entire conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the beautiful introduction. Thank you for beginning with Rihanna. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the panel, which is in 10 minutes. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.